Welcome back to Ghost Stories, y'all. This is episode 5. New Bern's Bleeding Arch. Okay. The city of New Bern, now shortened to New Bern, is one of the most beautiful and historic cities in the South. Its citizens are the citizens of Edenton, Bath, and other coastal settlements are blessed with a God-given sense of history. The magnificent restoration of Governor Tryon's colonial palace is a perfect example of the reverence these people feel for their Swiss American heritage. Named after the city of Bern in Switzerland, New Bern was settled by Baron de Graffenried and the Palatines, artisans from Switzerland and Germany, in the late 1600s under the aegis of England. From the early date until today, it has played a prominent part in the history of North Carolina, some of which mised, situated at the junction of the Neuse and Trent rivers. New Bern was very accessible to the sailing ships of the day. It was indeed a deep water outpost in the new continent. So ancient is a part of the town that the framework of the original Anglican church is still preserved there. In this early house of worship, the dead were buried beneath the floor of the nave of the church to keep the Indians from knowing of any weakening of the town's strength. On Queen Street, also in the heart of the old town of New Bern, one can still find a very old cemetery called Cedar Grove Cemetery, commanding a beautiful view of the broad sweep of the Neuse River. This truly antebellum burying ground is the location of many fascinating legends and stories. Some of these appear to have real elements of truth, while others are apparently pure folk legend and may have sprung from some historical event. The cemetery was conveyed in the year 1800 to Christ Church. The church itself was already an ancient landmark at the time. Although it was in beautiful condition, it still is and is used daily by its Episcopal congregation down to this good hour. Christ Church opened the cemetery in that same year, and it has been in use, with many enlargements to the present. The old part of Cedar Grove Cemetery is enclosed by an equally ancient stone wall, and entrance is gained through a very imposing stone arch. The wall and the arch were constructed by local masons with large blocks of what the natives call shell stone. The material, which is quarried locally, far from the distant mountains, is composed of millions of ossified seashells and the fossilized skeletons of other large and small sea creatures. These little beings sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, which at that time covered New Bern. Over millions of years, they gradually hardened into a sort of coral-like stone, in which you can clearly see the outlines of the seashells. This material is very hard, like stone, but it can be cut fairly easily into large blocks. The masons of that day used these blocks well in constructing with great skill and loving care both the wall and the imposing archway of the entrance. The cemetery itself is unusual and historic, but it is also marked by a fascinating phenomenon. Since the memory of man runneth not to the contrary, the archway has been used as the entrance for funeral processions into the burial ground. Its generous width provides plenty of room for the casket and the pallbearers on either side. From that day to this, such processions are greeted by the dripping of what appears to be blood upon the mourners passing beneath the arch. Not a stream, mind you, but a slow and temporary drip, 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 and then a halt. This substance is red. It is slightly sticky. There is no apparent source, and it always drops on funerals in a sequence of 3 drops, then a pause, then 3 more drops, then another pause, and so on. One of the legends concerning this arch, held with conviction by some of the older residents, states that if one or more of the drops fall upon the head of one of the pallbearers, that person will be the next out of that group to die and be carried through the same arch. They even quote some rather startling statistics to prove their point, giving names and dates. There are other stories relating to the arch, and at least one of them is based on the early history of this country. It concerns a duel that should never have happened and a tragedy that resulted in a great loss to North Carolina and the nation. New Bern produced many stalwart sons who played important parts in the early history of the region. The Baron de Graffenried, although Swiss by birth, was certainly a New Bernian, as was John Lawson, the Surveyor General of the Crown Colony, and Governor Eden, along with many, many others. One of the more well-known was a man named Richard Dobbs Speight. He was very active in the formation not only of Carolina, but also of the nation. He was one of the first governors of the state of North Carolina, and he devoted his entire life to serving his region, his state, and his fledgling nation. He practiced law in New Bern when he was not holding some public office. When he was not holding some public office. He was widely known and loved by almost everyone. Politics being what they are and ever have been, Governor Speight in 1802 became embroiled in a spirited difference of political philosophy with a man named John Stanley, another New Bernian of some importance. He was a lawyer of considerable ability and was noted, most of all, for his force of invective and sarcasm. In his later years, he was elected to the state legislature, where he served with distinction. He served as Speaker of the House and ruled that chamber with a rod of iron. Now, the story is told that when General Lafayette visited the new United States in 1825, Stanley introduced a bill to appropriate considerable money with which to give the general an appropriate North Carolina welcome. He was bitterly opposed on this bill by a number of conservative members, and it was though that the vote would be a close one. When the vote was called for, Stanley arose from his speaker's seat, called another member to preside in his stead, and then, glaring down at his opponents, roared, "Mr. Speaker, I too desire to put every member on record so that if any one votes against this bill, he may be gibbeted high up on the pillory of infamy." Strong language, even for those days, and words that could have easily led to a challenge to a duel. It is recorded that every man somewhat awed voted aye, and the bill passed unanimously. Such was the ability and the temperament of the government Speight's adversary. The debate in the New Bern between John Stanley and Governor Speight grew acrimonious, and in the fashion of the day, it was proposed that the difference be settled by a duel to the death. Thus, a challenge was issued and accepted, and arrangements were made for the field of honor, in which marksmanship and luck would be called upon to decide who was right and who was wrong. It was to be pistols at an agreed distance and firing upon signal. Spate was a man of peace and was unused to using a firearm, but his honor demanded that he abide by the rules and seek to kill or be killed by his fellow lawyer. It seems incredible today that men of the intelligence of those involved should engage in such illogical behavior. But dueling, according to a strict code duello, was the order of the day, and the two men were locked into the situation. Thus it was that the field of honor was chosen, set up, and prepared by the seconds of each man. The location of the encounter was chosen, a very pleasant alley paved with handmade brick and situated just a few hundred yards from Cedar Grove Cemetery. There, very early on the morning of September 5th, both Stanley and Spate showed up dressed in their very best clothing. Each was accompanied by a second. There were a few other witnesses there, too, some of them sensation seekers, but most of them deeply concerned citizens. These very earnest men pleaded with the principals to find some other way to settle their differences. Spate might have agreed to this if an honorable way could have been found, but it is said that Stanley seemed thirsty for blood, and that he cut short this discussion of alternatives. The seconds then brought forward a brace or pair of pistols in a mahogany velvet-lined case. The weapons looked and probably were identical, and each was loaded with the same amount of powder and the same size shot. The principals were then each shown the exact spot on which to stand, so that the rising sun would be in neither man's eyes, and were told to await the signal. Spate and Stanley each took his weapon, glanced at it, and then walked slowly and deliberately to his assigned station. The early morning sun was beginning to light the tops of the trees, and a few birds began to greet the dawn of a beautiful early fall day with song. Down on the field of honor, there was a deathly silence. Off to one side of the intended line of fire, the seconds and the spectators waited as the elder of the seconds held aloft his white silk handkerchief. "Gentlemen," he said, "I shall now count to 3. At the count of 3, I shall release this handkerchief, and you may fire at will. You do not have to wait until the handkerchief touches the ground, but may fire at the count of 3. And now, please take aim. 1, 2. At the count of 3, as the handkerchief fluttered downward, the 2 pistols roared as one. Strangely, both shots missed their mark, and the duelists stood unharmed. The pistols were reloaded, and once again, the 2 statesmen fired at each other. Once again, they both missed. The spectators had grown in number as the firing continued, and now they redoubled their efforts to effect a compromise, but things had apparently gone too far. Shots had been fired, and under the code duello, the whole thing could have been called off then with no shame to anyone. But this was not to be. This time, the 2 principals were placed 10 steps apart, facing away from each other. They were handed reloaded pistols and told to wheel and fire at the given word. It is thought that the seconds were trying to increase the likelihood of another miss and perhaps reduce the duel to an absurdity, but when the word was given, an entirely different result occurred. Whether intentionally or not, Governor Spate's bullet missed Stanley and embedded itself in a brick wall. Stanley's bullet sped straight and true and struck Spate in the chest, inflicting a mortal wound from which he died in a very short time. Thus, North Carolina was deprived of one of its brightest and most patriotic sons in the very prime of his life, and at a time when his leadership was critically needed. Stanley, still bloodthirsty, soon thereafter tried to pick a quarrel with Spate's son with the avowed intention, it is said, of challenging the boy to a duel and thus ridding himself once and for all of not one but two of his opponents. After the duel, it was first thought that Governor Spate would be buried in Cedar Grove Cemetery, and it is said that a grave was opened there to receive his body. His family, however, decided that he should be buried on land owned by the family and located just west of the town of New Bern. It is there that his last resting place is preserved to this day. Public indignation blazed against Stanley, and there was talk of seeing to it that he was justly punished one way or another. He had abided by the Code Duello to the letter, however, and other than being shunned by many of his former friends, he was never brought to account for Spate's death. There are those in New Bern who say that the majestic arch of the Cedar Grove has not forgotten his death. They say that the drops of blood continue to call, even at this late day, for vengeance. Drip, drip, drip. Avenge Spate's blood. Drip, drip, drip. Avenge Spate's blood. And those drops surely do look like blood and feel like blood to the touch. Some explain them by surmising that the masons who constructed the stonework used notched iron spikes between the topmost stones of the arch, spikes which today are invisible to the naked eye because of the way they were embedded between the stones. They say that these iron spikes have continued to rust away over the years, and that the moisture of rains soaked up by this semi-porous stone supply the liquid that causes the arch to drip, drip, drip. True it is that the arch does not bleed solely on the occasion of funerals. It bleeds at other times and at no predictable intervals. But it is also true that when it does bleed, it bleeds in groups of 3 consecutive drips. Never more, never less. Just as the seconds count of 1, 2, 3 was in cadence at the duel, and just as the slogan, Avenge Spate's blood, is in the same cadence. Whether or not you believe any of the legends associated with the ancient arch, it would seem to be the sensible thing to try to avoid being struck by the drops. The very least that can happen is that you may incur an expensive dry cleaning or laundry bill. What do you think? Okay, you guys, this is story number 2, The Flaming Ship of Ocracoke. Some most unusual things continue to happen just off the northern shore of Ocracoke Inlet. Of course, this region is known to the world over as a part of the graveyard of the Atlantic, and many other are the tales of shipwrecks and sailors lost at sea, and of treasures lying buried beneath the shifting sands of the Diamond Shoals. Most of these legends have no recurring manifestations but the Ocracoke happening, they say, repeats itself year after year, always under the same conditions and always at the same spot. Many people have seen it time after time, and always on the night when the new moon makes its first appearance in September. Thus, the dates may differ from year to year, but that silver of the new moon is always part of the scene. In the region itself, the most widely accepted explanation is a combination of history and folk memory, which has been told and retold by the older fishermen to their sons and grandsons. Many of these old-timers may not be able to name the current Secretary of the Interior, but they can tell you with amazing accuracy of the time when Anne was Queen of England and many efforts was being made to colonize the Carolinas. This was a time when the continent of Europe was in a ferment. The tiny German Palatinate had been overrun time and again by the vicious wars between Catholic and Protestant armies. The people were weary, weary with so-called religious wars, and they longed for peace. In the beautiful Rhine River Valley in 1689, the retreating armies of Louis the 14th had brutally scourged and laid waste the entire countryside, leaving everything destroyed and most of the people destitute. Some 10,000 Palatines, as they were called, flooded into England for refuge, and the authorities did not know what to do with them. No beggars, these but honest and skilled craftsmen, miners, and artisans of the first order. Such an influx of jobless thousands threw the British economy completely out of kilter. Now, the British people, though sympathetic at first, soon began to complain. So the English Queen listened with favor when the Swiss Baron Christoph de Graffenried, eager to mend his own personal fortunes and to solve the problems of many of the Palatines at the same time, proposed taking several hundred of these poor people to the province of Carolina in the New World across the sea. England desperately needed colonists, and the Palatines just as desperately needed new homes. So Queen Anne told de Graffenried to go ahead with his plan. The mass migration, organized and directed by the good Baron, was beset by trials and tribulations, but it finally resulted in the settlement of a large portion of land in what is now eastern North Carolina. The settlement was known at first by the Indian name Chatoka. Today, it is identified as the beautiful city of New Bern, formerly New Bern. Many people know of these fine Swiss and German folk who have meant so much to the history of North Carolina and of their leader, Baron de Graffenried, the Landgrave of North Carolina. Most people, though, do not know about a later shipload of Palatines whose financial status was much better, but whose destiny was not to be so bright. While homeless, they were still possessed of a large amount of gold and silver plate, gold candlesticks, and many valuable coins and jewels, which they had managed to conceal from invading armies. Whereas the earlier Palatines had come to America by means of financing furnished by the British government. These later emigrants paid for their own passage by subscription among themselves. They, too, were looking for a new and better home in Carolina. They had heard good reports of the colony from their friends who had come over with de Graffenried and were eager to make their own beginnings in the new land. The passage from England was uneventful, as day followed sunny day, and the ship made good time. The hopes of these thrifty Palatines were high as they looked forward to soon joining their countrymen in New Bern. Each of them had been very careful to conceal his precious possessions in the sea bags and chests allowed in the sleeping quarters below decks. So far as could be seen, they were just as poor as their friends who had come before them. At that time, Ocracoke Inlet was the principal point of entry for ships with passengers or cargoes bound for the interior of North Carolina. Now, ocean-going vessels could negotiate the inlet and sail over the shallow sounds to the inland cities, or they could, and usually did, anchor just inside or outside the inlet and transfer the passengers or cargoes to smaller boats which were bound for New Bern, Bath, or Edenton. Travelers were usually given a few hours in which to stretch their legs and walk about in Portsmouth town before beginning the final lap of their journey. Thus, it was with the ship carrying these later Palatines. They arrived offshore before dawn and anchored in the calm waters just to the seaward from Ocracoke Inlet. The passengers were in a fever of excitement. Lights could be seen from the houses on the nearby shore, and the smell of wood smoke from the early morning cooking fires in Pilot Town, now called Ocracoke Village, carried across the water to the pilgrims. The children were the most enthusiastic of all as they ran back and forth on the deck, laughing and playing. The perilous sea voyage was over, and they were now only a short distance from their new homes. Among the adults, there was more sober talk of Indians and whether or not they would continue to be friendly, of gold mines, and of the prospect of living without the constant threat of war. It was a time of new beginnings. They believed that they had at last found a fresh page on which to write their own personal histories. By the time it was fully daylight, all the Palatines were dressed in their best clothes and were assembled on the deck of the ship. They were eager to set foot on land and to see the sights of Portsmouth town. Not wanting to risk the theft of valuables, they made the mistake of bringing these belongings up on deck with them. There they stood, their eyes full of hope and anticipation, and their hands full of more treasure than the ship's captain had ever seen in any one place in his entire lifetime. Unknown to his passengers, the captain had at one time been a pirate, but he had taken the king's pardon, promising to lead a law-abiding life. At the sight of the Palatine's treasure, however, his new moral code promptly went by the board. Calling a hurried meeting with his crew, the skipper found them all of a like mind to his. This was too easy a chance to be missed. So, the plot was laid. The captain told his passengers that there had been some delay in arranging their transportation to New Bern, but he promised to take care of that by the next morning. He advised them to return to their quarters below decks and to get some rest against the rigors of the next stage of their travels, as they would not be able to go ashore until the next day. This the Palatines did, taking their belongings with them, not even questioning the fact that the captain had waved away several small boats and lighters which had come out to get the business of taking passengers and their belongings ashore. The night that followed was the first night of the new moon in that September of long ago. The sun had set hours before, and the new moon was low in the sky when the crew, led by the captain and both mates, slipped up behind the few passengers, taking the air on deck, and silently strangled them with short lengths of line. Then silently and swiftly they crept below, knives in hand, and cut the throats of every remaining passenger, children as well as adults. Not one was spared. These brutal murders accomplished, the crew then brought lights into the hold and methodically ripped open all of the sea bags and chests belonging to the murdered people, stealing all the gold, silver, jewels, and coins they had so much coveted on the deck of the ship that morning. Pirate-like, they divided their loot on the deck of the ship. Then, lowering the ship's longboat into the sea, they prepared to go ashore. Just before they left the ship, they spread the vessel's mainsail and jib and slipped the anchor chain so that the craft could run before the gentle southwest wind. As a final touch, the captain set fire to the large pile of rifled sea bags and chests which had been heaped over the manifest. This was to make more credible the tale of disaster they intended to tell when they reached the shore. About halfway to shore, the men rested their oars and looked back at the ship. The captain turned his head too and saw that the fire had spread more rapidly than he had anticipated. Apparently, the lines holding the furled topsails and the top gallant sails to the yard had burned in two. Now all the sails seemed to be set, and the ship was driving at full speed, not in a northeasterly direction, but almost due west, right toward the crowded longboat. The sails seemed to be solid sheets of flame, and from the hold of the burning ship came long, loud, pitiful wails, filling the dark sea with the mournful sounds of souls in torment. The inferno ship bore down upon the frantically fleeing longboat until, with a crash of splintering timbers, it rolled the doomed little craft over and over until its keel, spilling the murderous robbers into the sea. Most of them drowned outright. Some, however, were able to cling to pieces of wreckage from the longboat until they were washed ashore many hours later. Amazingly, the burning death ship then came about, and with no living soul at her lashed helm, set a steady course toward the northeast again, her sails still aflame and the mournful wails still emanating from the hold. To this day, they say that flaming ship reappears on the first night of the new moon in September. Her sails are always sheets of flame, and her rigging glows red hot in the near darkness. Always there is the accompanying eerie wailing as she sails swiftly and purposefully toward the northeast. 3 times she runs her ghostly course on each occasion. She always seems to sail from the water just offshore to a point where she can barely be seen as a small glow on the distant horizon. They say she will sail out of sight, and then, twice again, she will suddenly reappear just offshore and sail toward the northeast. Those who have seen her say you can always smell the odor of burning canvas and hemp, and she always moves northeastward, regardless of the direction and velocity of the wind. So far as known, not one single piece of the treasure belonging to the doomed Palatines has ever been washed up on the beach. So far as can be told, the flaming ship will continue to sail her fiery course each year while those betrayed pilgrims continue to look for peace and happiness in that new home to which they came so near.